Ever feel like where you come from like really sets you on a certain path in life? You know,
Oh, yeah.
like your parents' education or even where you grew up playing a bigger role than you'd maybe like to admit.
Absolutely.
Well, that's exactly what we're digging into in this deep dive. This academic paper on education in Latin America and the Caribbean, it really unpacks these ideas in a way that really got me thinking.
One of the things that struck me about this research is how they don't just say, oh, education is a problem, kind of a blanket statement.
Right.
They really dig deep and use all sorts of data. I'm
Hmm.
talking household surveys, those big international PISA tests, even wage information,
Okay, wow.
to paint this really comprehensive picture of who's succeeding in education in these areas, and maybe more importantly, why.
Right. And, we hear a lot about the challenges facing Latin America and the Caribbean when it comes to education. And sure, there's been progress in getting more kids in school.
Absolutely.
But this paper really highlights how it's not just about attendance, right? It's about this persisting gap in quality and who actually makes it to those higher levels of education, which is a whole other can of worms.
Yeah, and that's where this concept that the researchers call the parent trap comes in.
Okay, Parent Trap. I like it. Lay it on me.
So it turns out that if you want to predict whether someone, let's say in Mexico, Ecuador, Peru, or Brazil, will finish high school,
Okay.
knowing whether their parents finished high school is a surprisingly strong indicator.
Wow. That's kind of disheartening when you think about it.
It really is. It suggests that your parents' education casts a long shadow
Yeah.
over your own educational journey.
It really makes you question how level the playing field really is.
Exactly, exactly. And it gets even more eye-opening. The research found that in a lot of these countries, having a parent with a college degree is almost like a guaranteed ticket to getting your own degree.
Wow.
And they contrasted this with countries like the US and Korea, where sure, parental education still matters, but it's not this almost like a determinative factor.
Right, right.
So you see quite a difference there.
It really is amazing to think that just by the sheer, luck of where you're born
Right.
could have such a huge impact
Huge impact, yeah.
on your life. It's kind of a scary thought in a way.
It is, it is. And it gets even more granular and frankly more concerning when you start to look at where people live.
Okay, so we're talking about the whole rural versus urban divide here.
Exactly.
And I mean, it's no secret that rural areas often have fewer resources, right?
Sure.
But what really struck me in this paper is that the gap isn't just staying the same, it's actually widening and at an alarming rate.
Yeah, they highlighted Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, Brazil as seeing this trend play out most dramatically.
It's one thing to acknowledge a problem, right?
Yeah.
But to see the data that shows it's actually getting worse,
Right.
that's kind of alarming.
It is alarming,
Yeah.
especially when you consider the long-term implications for these countries, for these communities.
Exactly. And speaking of long-term implications, they also delve into this really fascinating comparison of public and private schools, which I think is super relevant for anyone who's really into the data side of education.
And it's a stark comparison. The researchers found that the difference in test scores between public and private school students in Latin America and the Caribbean is huge.
Wait, so hold on. Are we saying that it's even bigger than the gap we already see in places like the US, where we're constantly talking about inequalities in educational resources?
Significantly larger, actually, which is really saying something.
That's mind-blowing, honestly.
It is, and it gets even more nuanced. It's not simply a case of wealthy kids going to private schools and acing their tests.
Right, because that would be too simple.
Exactly. What they found is that you actually have a lot of wealthy families who are choosing to keep their kids in the public system, but their scores still reflect this disparity.
Wow, that's really interesting.
Right. It suggests that there are these deeper systemic differences, whether it's teaching standards or curriculum or even just overall expectations.
Right, right.
There's something else going on.
It's not just about, throwing money at the problem.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's far more complex than that. It really makes you think twice about this idea that education is the great equalizer,
Yeah,
When you see this kind of systemic difference, it really challenges that notion.
totally. And it makes you wonder, what happens next, right? If
Right.
the playing field is this uneven from the start, how does that impact people's lives once they're done with school and they're trying to make their way in the world?
And that's where the paper takes this really crucial turn, I think.
Okay.
It goes beyond just looking at test scores in isolation. It connects those disparities to things like income and job opportunities.
Okay, so how does that connection play out?
Well, They found that while returns to education have declined somewhat in recent years,
Okay.
that's a whole other conversation we could have.
Right, right.
The research still shows that having a college degree in Latin America and the Caribbean gives you a much bigger boost in earning potential than in many other parts of the world.
Wait, so even with all these barriers we've been talking about, if you do manage to get through the system,
Right.
the payoff is actually greater.
Exactly. Exactly.
Oh,
It's almost like this double-edged sword.
yeah.
On one hand, it underscores just how crucial education is as a means of economic mobility. But on the other
It
hand,
kind of highlights those inequalities even more.
it throws those inequalities we've been talking about into even sharper relief, right? Because if it's that much more valuable
Right,
and it's already harder to get,
right. The stakes are even higher.
the stakes are much higher. And the paper really emphasizes that. They argue that these inequalities in education are directly fueling income inequality more broadly.
Yeah. And we know that has all sorts of ripple effects, right? I mean, everything from healthcare to...
Absolutely. It touches on every aspect of society.
Yeah, it's really far-reaching. And I think that's what makes this kind of research so important,
Yeah.
because it's not just presenting this data in a bubble, it's actually connecting the dots to these larger systemic problems.
Absolutely. And it encourages us to think about it in a more holistic way.
It makes you kind of uncomfortable, but in a good way,
It does. It does. It's challenging, but it's a necessary challenge,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes the paper's conclusion so powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Because it doesn't just say, well, this is a problem and leave us feeling discouraged.
Right.
It actually pushes us to think about solutions.
Okay, good. So they offer some hope, like,
Yeah.
what can we do?
Well, they're careful not to oversimplify things.
Right.
Because as we've seen, the issues are incredibly complex. But they propose that maybe instead of trying to just import policies that have worked in other contexts,
Right.
we need to be thinking about what would be uniquely effective in Latin America and the Caribbean.
So thinking outside the box a little bit more,
Yeah.
tailoring it to,
Absolutely. Context is key.
right, the specific challenges of
Yeah.
each place.
Precisely. Precisely. And they even go a step further,
Hmm.
suggesting that maybe, just maybe, we need to rethink our entire perspective on the role of education itself.
Okay, now you're really making me think. What kind of shift are we talking about here?
So it's about moving beyond this idea of education as, just a way to get a good job, climb the economic ladder.
Right.
What if we started thinking about it as a way to build a more cohesive society,
Okay.
a way to create more of a sense of shared opportunity?
So using education as a tool to kind of bridge those divides we were talking about earlier.
Exactly, exactly. Investing in quality education for every child, not just as a way to, boost the economy,
Right.
but as a way to create a more just and equitable society overall.
Now, that's a really powerful idea, especially after, looking at all this data.
Yeah.
That really highlights how deep these inequalities run.
It's about saying everyone deserves a chance to succeed, regardless of where they come from or their parents' background.
Absolutely. And I love how this deep dive doesn't just point out the problems,
Right.
It actually pushes us to think about solutions and from a totally different perspective.
And hopefully inspires some action.
Yes, it's a call to action for sure.
Yeah.
And I think that's got to resonate with our listeners, especially those of you out there who, like me, believe that education can be this incredible force for positive change.
Absolutely. And it's not just for educators or policymakers. It's for anyone who cares about social justice.
Right. Everyone has a role to play in this.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because we've laid out the problem pretty clearly. The inequality in Latin American and Caribbean education is undeniable.
Right.
But the question remains, what are we going to do about it?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is. And there aren't any easy answers. But I think just having that sense of urgency, that desire to find solutions,
Right.
solutions that really work and are equitable, that's where it starts.
Yeah, it's about sparking a conversation
Absolutely.
and hopefully some real change. So for all our listeners out there, don't let this be where the conversation ends,
Right.
Take what you've learned, let it simmer for a bit, and let it spark your own ideas. Because at the end of the day, education is all about igniting possibilities. And who knows, maybe this deep dive will be the spark that helps create a brighter, more equitable future for Latin America and the Caribbean.